There is a specific kind of courage that doesn't look like courage. It doesn't stand up straight. It doesn't make speeches. It doesn't arrive with weapons drawn and jaw set, and the kind of cinematic certainty that gets documented in military commendations. It crouches down, gets to eye level, and growls back. Chief Medical Officer Daren Osei had been the senior medic aboard the GRC Steadfast Meridian for 6 years. In 6 years, he had treated 41 species, navigated 9 medical emergencies that the textbooks hadn't prepared him for, and once performed emergency surgery on a Kethari lieutenant using equipment designed for a completely different biology and a considerable amount of improvisation that he had quietly left out of the official report. He had never, in 6 years, been growled at by a patient. Not like this. The cub was small. That was the first thing. Relative to what it was going to become, relative to what its species was documented to be at full development, it was small, maybe 60 kilograms, roughly the dimensions of a large earth dog. If a large earth dog had evolved in an environment that had decided teeth were a concept worth committing to completely. It was also injured, left foreleg, deep laceration, debris contamination, the kind of wound that announced itself clearly and required immediate attention and was going to become significantly worse without it. It was also alone. That was the thing Daren kept coming back to as he approached the medical bay holding pen with his kit and his scanner and the careful measured movements of someone who had read the Vraket species file twice on the walkover. Alone. No pack. No adult present. Just the cub. And the growl. Low. Continuous. The sound of something small and hurt and terrified that had decided the only available option was to be as frightening as possible. Daren stopped, set down his kit, and growled back. The growl surprised everyone except Daren. Nurse practitioner Yellowsorn, standing 3 feet behind him with a secondary med kit and the expression of someone rapidly revising their emergency protocols, made a sound that was not quite a word. Lieutenant Kale Voss, stationed at the holding pen entrance for what the mission brief had described as routine security observation, took one involuntary step backward and then stopped himself with the visible effort of someone remembering their professional dignity at the last possible moment. The cub froze. Not the freeze of something preparing to attack. Not the coiled stillness of a predator calculating angles. The freeze of something that had expected a very specific response to its growl and had received something so completely outside that expectation that its entire behavioral framework had momentarily stalled. It stared at Daren. Daren stared back. He had not done anything dramatic, nothing loud, nothing that would register as a threat display in any species file he had ever read. Just a low sound from somewhere in his chest, roughly matching the frequency and duration of what the cub had produced, delivered with the calm matter-of-fact energy of someone making an introduction. "I heard you," the growl had said. "I'm not frightened. I'm not leaving. Here I am." The cub's 4 eyes blinked in sequence. "Sir," Yella said very quietly. "What was that?" Acknowledgement, Daren said, equally quiet, not taking his eyes off the cub. The Vraket species file doesn't mention. The species file, Daren said, was written by people who never got close enough. He crouched down, slowly, deliberately, making himself smaller, less imposing, less the thing standing over an injured creature that couldn't get up. The cub watched him, still frozen, still processing. Daren picked up his scanner, held it sideways where the cub could see it, not pointing it, not advancing with it, just showing it. "This is what I have. This is what I'm going to use. No surprises." The cub's growl, which had faded during the freeze, started again, quieter this time, a question more than a warning. "I know," Daren said softly. "I know it hurts. I know you don't know me. I know you're scared." He paused. "I'm going to fix the leg," he said. "That's all I'm here for." The cub looked at the leg, then at Daren, then at the scanner. The growl faded again. Not gone. Not trust. Not yet. But the specific quality of it had changed. The frequency had dropped. The continuous threat sustain had softened into something more like waiting. Waiting, Daren thought, is enough to work with. He moved 1 inch closer. The cub didn't move back. Behind him, Yella had stopped breathing. Voss had his hand nowhere near his weapon, which Daren appreciated, because he had asked them both very specifically on the walkover and hadn't been entirely sure they'd listened. "Hand me the antiseptic," Daren said quietly. "Slowly. Don't reach over me. Around the left side." "Sir," Yella said, "the Vrakeith bite pressure is documented at—" "I know what it's documented at," Daren said. "The antiseptic, please." A pause. The antiseptic appeared at his left side. Daren took it without looking away from the cub. The cub watched the antiseptic, then looked at Daren's face. Daren kept his expression exactly where it was. Calm. Open. The face of someone who had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove, and was going to sit here on this floor for as long as it took. "Okay," he said softly. "Let's start." The leg took 40 minutes. Not because the injury was complicated. In a fully equipped medical bay, with a cooperative patient, Daren could have cleaned and closed that laceration in 12, 15 with debris extraction. But this was not a fully equipped medical bay situation. This was a holding pen floor, with a 60-kilogram predator cub who had decided, after considerable deliberation, to allow one specific human to come within arm's reach, and that permission was clearly understood to be moment by moment, revocable at any time, dependent entirely on Daren continuing to be exactly what he had presented himself as. Unhurried, honest, present. So 40 minutes. He narrated the whole thing. Not for Yella, not for Voss, not for the medical record that was technically supposed to be running, but which Daren had quietly asked Yella to pause because the last thing a frightened cub needed was the additional stimulus of official documentation equipment. For the cub, steady, calm, continuous sound. The same principle his grandmother had used with frightened animals on the farm where he'd grown up. A piece of information that had not appeared in any medical school curriculum, but had turned out to be more useful than several things that had. "This is antiseptic," he said, showing the applicator. "It's going to sting. I'm telling you now, so it's not a surprise. Surprises are worse than the thing itself. Always." The cub watched the applicator. "The debris in the lower section needs to come out first," Daren continued, switching to the extraction tool with the same deliberate show-before-use motion. "This part is going to be uncomfortable. I'll be as fast as I can. Fast is better than careful for this part. I need you to hold still for about 30 seconds. He looked at the cub directly. "Can you do 30 seconds? The cub stared at him. "I'll count," Daren said, out loud. "So, you know where we are." He moved to the leg. The cub flinched. Daren stopped, waited, let the flinch settle, then moved again. Slower. The cub held. 1, Daren said. 2, 3. Behind him, Yella had sat down on the floor at some point. He could hear it in the change of her breathing. She was watching with the focused attention of someone who had stopped monitoring for threats and started watching a procedure she hadn't seen before. 12, 13, 14. The cub made a sound. Not a growl. Something smaller. Lower. The sound of something in pain that has decided to endure the pain because the person causing it has, somehow, established sufficient credibility to be trusted with it. "I know," Daren said. "Almost there. 21. 22. 29. 30. He pulled back, gave the cub a full 15 seconds, then showed the extraction tool again, clean now, debris removed. "That was the worst part," he said. "Everything from here is easier. I promise." The cub looked at the clean tool, then at Daren's face, then did something that made Yella inhale sharply behind him. It shifted its injured leg. Slightly. Just slightly, moving it closer to Daren. Not a dramatic gesture, not a cinematic moment of interspecies breakthrough, just a small, exhausted movement from a creature in pain that had run a rapid and brutal cost-benefit analysis and arrived at a conclusion. This one, the movement said, this one can be trusted with the rest. Daren kept his face exactly where it was. But something behind his sternum did something he'd deal with later when he wasn't in the middle of a procedure. "Thank you," he said quietly, and got back to work. The cub was asleep before Daren finished the closure. Not sedated, not treated with anything that would cause drowsiness. Just asleep, the profound, collapsed, total sleep of something that had been running on fear and adrenaline for long enough that the moment those two things released their grip, even slightly, the body underneath simply gave up and went horizontal. Daren finished the closure anyway. Same pace, same narration, quieter now, same careful movements, even though the cub couldn't see them anymore. Last seal, he said softly to no one. Clean margins. Should heal without complications if it stays off the leg for 48 hours. He sat back on his heels, looked at the sleeping cub for a moment, at the slow rise and fall of something that had been terrified an hour ago and was now, by all available biological evidence, completely at peace. He started packing his kit. Sir, Yella said. She had moved closer during the procedure. He hadn't noticed when. She was crouched now at his right, voice low. That was... She stopped. Started again. I've been a nurse practitioner for 11 years, she said. I've never seen anything like that. Frightened things need information, Daren said. What's happening? What comes next? How long it's going to last? It doesn't matter the species. Fear is fear. You growled at it, Voss said from the entrance. He had moved closer to, at some point. The security observation posture had become something else. At the start, what was that? Introduction, Daren said, in its language, approximately. You don't speak Vrakith. No, Daren agreed, but I speak frightened. He closed his kit, looked around the holding pen properly for the first time since he'd entered it. Standard military configuration. Hard surfaces, bright overhead lighting, the ambient temperature 3 degrees too cold for human comfort, and probably for Vrakith comfort too, given the species' documented preference for warmer environments. This pen, he said, standard holding configuration, Voss said. It's wrong, Daren said. Not accusatory, just factual. Temperature needs to go up 4 degrees. Lighting needs to come down by 60%. It needs something in here it can get under or behind. Prey species instinct is documented in juvenile Vrakith, even though they're predators. When they're injured or frightened, they want cover. Voss looked at the pen. I can requisition. Today, Daren said, not tomorrow. Yes, sir. Daren looked at the sleeping cub one more time. At the closed laceration. Clean work. He was professionally satisfied with it. He was about to stand up when the cub moved. Not waking. Still completely asleep. Just shifting the way sleeping things shift, redistributing weight, resettling. Toward him. The sleeping cub moved 3 inches toward where Daren was crouched, then settled, then went completely still again. Deeply, totally asleep. Daren looked at the 3 inches. Yella looked at the 3 inches. Even Voss, from the entrance, had seen it. Nobody said anything for a moment. I'll stay, Daren said quietly, until it wakes up. Someone should be here. Sir, you have a full patient roster at. Yella, Daren said. Can you cover the roster for 2 hours? A pause. Yes, she said. I can cover the roster. She gathered her kit, stood up, looked at Daren sitting on a holding pen floor next to a sleeping predator cub and the 3 inches between them. Sir, she said. The growl, she said. Teach me that. Daren looked up at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. It's not about the sound, he said. It's about what's behind it, which is... He looked back at the cub, at the slow breathing, the closed laceration, the 3 inches. Certainty, he said. You have to be completely certain that you're not leaving. The sound is just how you say it out loud. Yella looked at the cub for a long moment, nodded once, left. Voss followed her after a pause that suggested he had more to say and had decided this wasn't the moment for it. The holding pen was quiet. Daren sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his kit beside him and the sleeping cub 3 inches away. Outside, the pen, the Steadfast Meridian, continued its operations with the steady, indifferent efficiency of a military vessel that didn't know it had just become something slightly different. A place where a frightened cub had decided, based on 40 minutes and a growl, that one specific human could be trusted with the worst parts. Daren thought that was worth 2 hours on a holding pen floor. He thought it was worth considerably more than that. The cub woke up 3 hours later. Not 2, 3. Daren had stayed the extra hour without making a decision about it. The time had simply passed, and leaving hadn't seemed like the right thing to do, so he hadn't done it. He was reviewing patient files on his datapad when it happened. The shift was subtle. The breathing changed first. Then the quality of stillness changed, from the deep unconscious stillness of sleep to the lighter, aware stillness of something that had woken up and was taking stock before announcing itself. Daren didn't look up from his datapad. He had learned, somewhere between hour 1 and hour 3 on the holding pen floor, that direct attention felt like pressure to the cub, that looking away was a form of courtesy, that the most reassuring thing he could do right now was be completely unsurprised by the cub's existence. "You're here," his body language said. "I know you're here. I was here when you went to sleep, and I'm here now and nothing has changed." He heard the cub shift, heard it lift its head, heard the specific quality of silence that meant 4 eyes were currently examining him with the focused assessment of something running a complete threat evaluation. He kept reading his patient files. The evaluation apparently concluded in his favor. The cub made a sound. Small, rough around the edges. Nothing like the growl from 3 hours ago. Something younger than the growl. Something that the growl had been covering. Daren's translator was in his kit. He didn't need it. He looked up from the datapad. The cub was watching him with 2 of its 4 eyes. The other 2 were doing a sweep of the pen, checking the space, confirming what had changed while it slept. The temperature was 4 degrees warmer. The lighting was 60% lower. In the far corner, someone had placed a large equipment crate on its side, open end facing the center of the pen, creating exactly the kind of covered space Daren had described to Voss. The cub looked at the crate, looked at Daren. "Voss requisitioned it," Daren said, "while you were sleeping." The cub looked at the crate again. Then slowly, with the careful movement of something managing a healing leg, stood up. Daren watched without moving. The cub crossed the pen to the crate, investigated it with the thorough nose-led examination of a juvenile predator encountering an unfamiliar object, went around it once, looked inside, went around it again, then went inside, turned around, lay down, put its chin on the edge of the crate opening, and looked at Daren from inside its cover. Something in the cub's posture had changed completely. The held tension of the past 3 hours was gone. The specific, braced quality of something that had been managing pain and fear simultaneously with no relief from either had released, not all at once, but enough. Enough to look like a cub instead of a threat. "Better?" Daren said. The cub blinked. He took that as yes. He pulled a nutrition packet from his kit. Standard issue, the kind he carried for patients who needed calories post-procedure. Opened it, set it on the floor 3 feet from the crate opening, then went back to his datapad. He heard the cub leave the crate, heard it approach the nutrition packet, heard the packet disappear, heard the cub return to the crate. "You're going to need to stay off the leg," Daren said, without looking up. 48 hours. I'll come back tomorrow to check the closure." The cub made the small, rough sound again. Daren was starting to develop a working theory about that sound. It wasn't in any Vrakeith vocalization database he had access to. It wasn't in the species file. It wasn't in any of the encounter reports he had reviewed in the 3 hours of holding pen floor time he'd spent reading everything available on Vrakeith behavior. It was, he thought, simply too young to have been documented. The researchers who wrote the species file had never been close enough to hear it. The sound that existed before the growl, before the threat display, before the armor, the sound a Vrakeith cub made when it was just a cub. He made a note in the medical record. Patient vocalization, post-procedure, post-sleep, unprompted, non-threatening, possibly communicative. No existing database match. Recommend further documentation. He paused, added one more line. Possibly the sound of someone deciding you're safe. Insufficient data. Will observe. Outside the holding pen, the Steadfast Meridian continued its operations. Yella had covered the roster without complaint. Voss had requisitioned the crate within 20 minutes of leaving the pen. Nobody had asked Daren why he was still on the floor 3 hours later. They had all, in their own way, been in that pen. They had all heard the growl. They had all watched what came after it. Some things didn't need explaining. Some things just needed witnessing. Word traveled the way it always traveled on a military vessel. Not through official channels. Not through briefings or reports or the Steadfast Meridian's internal communication system that technically existed for exactly this purpose. Through people. Voss told the bridge crew, not as a report, as the thing you tell people when you've seen something you can't quite contain inside yourself anymore. He told it the way witnesses tell things, with the specific halting quality of someone still processing what they saw while they were saying it. Yella told the medical staff. More precisely, she told Ensign Tor, her most junior colleague, who had asked why she'd covered the full roster alone and received a 20-minute answer he hadn't expected. Ensign Tor told everyone else. By the following morning, the story had completed its circuit of the ship with the efficiency of something that had found exactly the right frequency to travel at. Everyone knew about the growl. Everyone knew about the floor. Everyone knew about the 3 inches. The reactions varied by department with an accuracy that Daren would have found professionally interesting if he'd been paying attention to them. Engineering thought it was practical. Navigation thought it was reckless. Medical staff were divided between deeply moved and deeply concerned. Occasionally, the same person felt both simultaneously. The captain called him at 0700. Captain Sarah Vane had commanded the Steadfast Meridian for 4 years. She was the specific kind of commanding officer who had learned, through careful observation and 1 or 2 significant early mistakes, that the best use of her authority was often restraint. She had a gift for identifying the moment to ask questions instead of issue directives. This felt like one of those moments. Chief Medical Officer Osei, she said, "Captain, I've read your medical report." "Yes, sir." The supplementary note at the end. "Yes, sir." A pause. Possibly the sound of someone deciding you're safe, she said. "Insufficient data. We'll observe." "Yes, sir." "Are you planning to continue observing?" "Daily check on the closure," Daren said. "Standard post-procedure protocol for lacerations of that depth. 48-hour minimum. Longer if there are complications. And if there aren't complications." Daren considered the question with the care it deserved. "The cub is alone," he said. "No pack. No adult Vrakeith present. The species file documents juvenile Vrakeith developmental requirements including social contact, environmental enrichment, and progressive challenge exposure during the growth phase." The species file, Captain Vane said, also said they were ungovernable. The species file, Daren said, was written by people who never spent 3 hours on a holding pen floor. Another pause. Longer this time. "What do you need?" the captain said. Daren had a list. He had made it somewhere around hour 2 on the floor, on the back of a patient intake form, in the margins around the Vrakeith developmental documentation he'd been reading. He had written it in the small, efficient handwriting of someone who was trying to be practical about something that felt considerably larger than practical. Expanded pen space. Appropriate temperature and light controls. Species-appropriate nutrition rather than standard rations. A developmental enrichment protocol that didn't yet exist and would need to be built from incomplete research, educated inference, and whatever the cub itself indicated worked. Time. Mostly time. "I'll send it formally," Daren said. "Within the hour." "Do that," the captain said. Then, before ending the call, Chief Medical Officer. "Sir." The growl. "Sir." Was it instinct, she asked, or training? Daren thought about it. About crouching on a floor. About the sound from his chest that he hadn't planned and hadn't calculated and hadn't sourced from any manual or medical school curriculum or species file. About his grandmother's farm. About frightened things and what they needed to hear before they could hear anything else. Neither, he said. It was just the right language for the moment. The captain was quiet for a second. "I want you to write that down too," she said. "In the report. That part specifically." "Yes, sir." Dismissed. He went to the pen at 0800. The cub was in the crate, chin on the edge, watching the door. When Daren came through it, the cub's posture changed. Not defensively. Not the brace of threat assessment. Something else. something that oriented toward him the way a plant orients toward light. Subtle and total and entirely without self-consciousness. "Morning," Daren said, the small rough sound. "Let me see the leg." The cub came out of the crate, crossed to him, stood still. No countdown, no narration needed, no 30 seconds of warning. Just stood still, and let him look at the leg with the complete, uncomplicated trust of something that had updated its files on this specific human and filed him under a category it hadn't needed before. "Safe," the file said. "Known. Mine." Daren checked the closure. Clean. No inflammation. Healing exactly as it should. He straightened up. The cub looked at him, then did something it had never done before in any of their interactions. It leaned its head against his leg. Not hard. Not demanding. Just resting. The weight of a chin and a cheek against his knee. Eyes half closed. The small rough sound continuous and low. Daren stood very still. Yella was at the pen entrance behind him. He heard her stop walking, heard the specific quality of silence that meant she was watching something she didn't want to interrupt. He didn't move. The cub didn't move. The Steadfast Meridian moved around them, systems and personnel, and the vast ordinary machinery of a military vessel in operation, none of it touching the quiet of this specific corner of holding pen where a predator cub had decided, without ceremony or negotiation, that this human's leg was a reasonable place to rest its head. "Insufficient data," Daren said quietly. "We'll observe." The cub sound continued, low and certain, like something that had found its frequency and intended to stay there. The formal report reached the Galactic Research Consortium on a Monday. It was 41 pages long. Pages 1 through 18 were Daren's medical documentation, injury presentation, treatment procedure, postoperative care, developmental protocol, daily observation logs spanning 6 weeks of pen visits that had evolved with the quiet inevitability of things that were always going to evolve this way, from medical checks into something the existing paperwork categories didn't quite cover. Pages 19 through 27 were Yella's nursing observations. She had taken Daren's advice about the growl. Not literally. She had never growled at anything, but she had understood what he meant about certainty, about the sound being just how you say it out loud, and she had found her own version of it, the specific quality of presence she brought into the pen each morning. Unhurried, unfrightened, completely certain she was allowed to be there. The cub had figured her out by day 4. By day 10, it had extended the same assessment to Voss. Voss, who had spent those 10 days finding reasons to be near the pen entrance, who had requisitioned the crate within 20 minutes, and then quietly, without being asked, requisitioned better nutrition and a secondary enrichment structure, and a thermal panel that kept the pen temperature exactly right. The cub had figured him out the day he installed the thermal panel himself instead of sending an engineering crew. It watched him work the whole time. When he finished and turned around, it was sitting 3 feet behind him. Voss had gone very still. The cub had made the small rough sound, then walked back to the crate. Voss had stood in the pen for a full minute before his legs remembered how to operate. He told Daren about it at dinner. His voice did something in the middle of the telling that 11 years of military service made a valiant and partially successful attempt to contain. "It's the sound," Daren said. "When you hear it, you'll know." "I know," Voss said. "I heard it." Pages 28 through 35 of the report were Dr. Bevan Shands, the consortium's senior Vrakeith behavioral specialist, the author of the species file, the person whose research had formed the foundational document that had described the Vrakeith as ungovernable, unsocializable, and fundamentally incompatible with sustained contact with non-Vrakeith species. Captain Vane had invited her aboard 6 weeks in. Not to review the situation, to observe it. Dr. Sean had arrived with the careful professional composure of someone prepared to document an anomaly and explain it within existing frameworks. She had watched Daren's morning pen visit on day 1 of her observation. She had watched the cub come out of the crate when the door opened, watched it cross the pen, watched it stand still for the leg check without being asked, watched it lean its head against Daren's knee after. She had stood at the pen entrance for a long time without writing anything. Then she went back to her quarters and spent the night reading everything Daren had submitted. Every daily log, every supplementary note, every margin annotation and behavioral observation, and carefully documented instance of the small rough sound that wasn't in any database. She wrote her section of the report in one sitting. It was the most significant thing she had written in 30 years of species research. It was also the shortest, 7 pages. The last paragraph read, "The existing Vrakeith behavioral classification is not wrong. It is observationally accurate for every documented encounter prior to this record. What it lacks is the data point that the Steadfast Meridian medical team generated not through research protocol or controlled study conditions, but through a single instinctive decision made by a chief medical officer on a holding pen floor. He made himself small. He stayed. He came back. The cub did the rest. What we classified as ungovernable was never ungovernable. It was simply in every prior encounter, never given a sufficient reason to govern itself differently. We were not studying the Vrakeith. We were studying what the Vrakeith did when it had no reason to trust us. Those are not the same study. The consortium's response arrived 3 weeks later. Not a revision request. Not a query for additional data. Not the cautious bureaucratic acknowledgement that significant findings usually generated while the institutional machinery decided what to do with them. A research designation, Vrakeith Socialization Study, Steadfast Meridian Longitudinal Documentation, with funding, and a request for continuation. Daren read the designation in his office at 0630, then went to the pen. The cub heard him coming before he reached the door. He knew because of the sound that preceded his entry, now the shift in the pen's ambient noise that meant the cub had woken up, stood up, and was waiting at the door. It had started doing that somewhere around week 3. He hadn't noted the exact day. He wished he had. He opened the door. The cub was there. Grown. 6 weeks of nutrition and healing and the particular flourishing of something that had stopped spending all its energy on fear. Still juvenile. Still months from anything approaching full Vrakeith development, but different from the 60 kilograms of terrified creature on the pen floor. More itself. Daren held up the consortium designation on his datapad. The cub looked at it with the polite interest it gave all datapads, which was moderate and primarily motivated by whether the datapad was going to produce food. It was not going to produce food. The cub looked at Daren instead, made the small rough sound. "I know," Daren said. "It means we stay." The cub leaned its head against his leg. The sound continued, low and certain. The frequency of something that had found where it belonged and had no intention of broadcasting the discovery to anyone who hadn't already earned it. The species file was updated 4 months later. Dr. Sean rewrote it herself. The new file was 3 times longer than the original. The behavioral classification section had been completely restructured around a framework that acknowledged what the Steadfast Meridian data had made undeniable. The Vrakeith were not ungovernable. They were discerning. There was a significant difference between the two, and the field had spent 30 years mistaking one for the other because nobody had been willing to sit on a holding pen floor and find out. The file's new introduction read, "Before consulting the behavioral classifications in this document, the reader is directed to Appendix C, First Contact Protocol, specifically page 1 of Appendix C, specifically the first line of page 1. Appendix C, page 1, line 1 read, Make yourself small. Stay. Come back. Everything else follows from that. In the pen on the Steadfast Meridian, the thermal panel hummed at exactly the right temperature. The light was exactly right. The crate in the corner had been upgraded twice, first by Voss and then by the engineering crew, who had started treating pen maintenance as a point of professional pride nobody had asked them to take, but everyone was glad they had. The cub was in the crate, chin on the edge, watching the door, waiting for the sound of someone it had decided, on a holding pen floor 6 months ago, was worth waiting for. The door opened. Daren came in. The cub came out of the crate, the small rough sound, the leg against his knee. The Steadfast Meridian moved through deep space around them, carrying its crew and its research designation and its 41-page report and 1 updated species file and the quiet daily evidence of what happened when someone decided that the right response to a growl was not distance, was not a weapon, was not a species file or a threat assessment or a holding pen and a locked door, was just a growl back. I hear you. I'm not leaving. Here I am.